This is Urban Agriculture, episode number 1, The Earliest Farmers.
This is Urban Agriculture, episode number 1, recorded on March 17th, 2014. Hi, everybody. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and with me is Dickson Despommier.
Hello, Vincent.
How are you doing there, Dickson?
I'm doing very well, Vincent.
Urban Agriculture?
Urban Agriculture, you bet.
And we subtitled this,
We did.
the talk show, all about the third green revolution.
Correct.
That was your idea.
That's true.
In fact, this whole thing is your idea.
Yeah.
Now that we've started, should I just leave?
No, I think this has to be a conversation between us.
So this is a brand new podcast.
Brand new.
It's not even on iTunes yet because we're recording it before. And you and I have made a couple of other podcasts
Founder
together.
session.
This week in virology, this week in parasitism.
That's right.
And you have been involved with, should we say, some aspect of urban agriculture for a while. So you wanted to start a podcast
Since
about
1999.
it. So how is this going to work, Dickson?
Well, it's interesting because we have had, as you know, numbers of conversations about how to begin such a podcast and what kind of information should we feature on it. And since our original discussions, this idea has grown into a full-blown set of protocols and a set of expectations, I should say. So the first expectation is that if anyone starts listening to urban agriculture, they first of all know what we mean by that. So we have to start to define.
What does it mean?
Urban agriculture for me means that inside the city limits, and this doesn't have to be exactly inside the city limits, it could be in the suburbs as well, people are actually finding ways of providing food for themselves or for other people using old traditional methods such as soil-based agriculture, or cutting-edge new technologically gifted kinds of agriculture using high-tech hydroponics, for instance, and aeroponics, and these are ponics that we'll be discussing later. And in fact, we will be interviewing people that are using them, so that makes this very exciting indeed. So
is this something new, urban agriculture?
Actually, it's extremely old. If you go back in time, you can find a time in our history as a people, as a species, in which cities were first forming, and inside those cities, people were raising various grain crops for the most part, but also domesticating animals as a way of providing the food for a growing population within early cities. And so urban agriculture has been around for a long, long time.
Is any sort of scale implied? Because here in New York City, people grow strawberries on their terrace, right?
That's true.
That's not urban agriculture?
Oh, no, it is. It's a form of urban agriculture, of course. As long as you're not growing stuff that you aren't supposed to be growing, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Although in 3 states you can do that too now.
Talking about marijuana?
I am talking about marijuana.
Oh, yeah.
But there are other crops like that you could possibly think of which would fall into that same category. Now, I'm talking about providing food for people who live in cities from the cities themselves, not from the outside world.
And you're talking about selling it. Commercially viable enterprises,
in most
right?
cases, yes, but there are some NGOs that we'd like to talk about as well. That means non-government organizations, non-profit food-raising centers, and we have a lot of those springing up, too, to empower people as to how to do this on their own.
So I'm here to ask questions.
You are.
And to have a conversation with
correct.
you. We're going to spend a few episodes filling in some fundamentals, right?
Yeah, I think we should do that first just to set the stage because people wonder, well, why would you ever want to grow food inside of a city when you can grow it outside on the farmland as we've been doing for about 10,000 years?
All right.
So I'd like to go back 10,000 years ago or even before that to explore the origins of agriculture as I know them and as I can present some general information to people that are now curious as to, but how did we become farmers to begin with? How did the human species depart from the traditional model of hunter-gatherers and morph into a sedentary, stay-at-home couch potato, no pun intended, of course, because we are discussing agriculture.
It's funny you should say potato. It's St. Patty's Day
It
today.
is true. This is St. Patrick's Day, but it is also it's a day when everybody's wearing green. So
I wore a green shirt.
I see that, and so did
so
I.
did you.
We both wore green today. Well, green has a double meaning in this case, right? Maybe three meanings. One is, of course, it signifies St. Patrick's Day. Two, a lot of people use the word green when they talk about money.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of other people are now talking about green technologies and green cities and green ways of behaving. And, of course, that means that you're environmentally friendly, meaning that you haven't done any harm to the outside world by what you're doing inside that world. And that's one of the big reasons for wanting to discuss urban agriculture, because the impact that agriculture has had on the planet has been astounding. Over the last 10,000 years of history, we have reshaped our world into a food supply that funnels most of what we grow and raise into these large urban centers. So it's had a huge impact on the ecology of the world itself.
Now, the purpose, well, why have a podcast about this, Dickson?
Well, and you and I know full well why you've asked that question, because we think that when you hear it, and then see the show notes after each of these podcasts, that it's better than having to sit down and reading a boring book.
Like your book.
Like my book, of course, or like anybody else's book on this subject. This makes it more immediate, and I think brings the players in front of the microphone, so to speak, which I will make every effort to do. And I've already had two people that I know very well who have been involved in this movement for quite a while now. Both have agreed to come onto the show. So I presume that most of the people who have made contact with me, at least, throughout the last 10 years of the time that I've been involved in this subject, those people will become my guests. And then you will hear from them what they think urban agriculture means and how it impacts their life and how their lives have changed as the result of getting involved in this movement.
So this podcast will be a mix of you and I discussing issues and guests who are players
Absolutely.
in the third green revolution. What does that mean,
No
Dickson?
question.
What
Okay,
is
let's
the
go.
third? That's our little subtitle for the podcast.
That's right.
So this podcast is called Urban Agriculture.
Right.
And we're eschewing the This Week In.
We are.
I felt we should move away from that, just to be different.
Right.
And then the subtitle is the talk show all about the third green revolution. What is the third? What is the first and the second?
Exactly. So that's what I want to discuss first. What was that first green revolution?
Should we, before that, first briefly,
Go on.
and I think it depends how long you're going to take. It's going to take a while to do this third green
I
revolution?
don't know. Well, yeah, it will consume the bulk of our show.
Let's first say, you, Dickson Despommier, professor at Columbia University, are a parasitologist.
That's true.
What the heck are you doing on a podcast? And me too, but I'm here to ask questions about urban agriculture. Why did you get into this at all? That's what I want to know.
Okay, but I have an equal question for you too.
You're going to answer every one of my questions.
No, I'm not going to do it that way, but I'm going to say, if I'm a parasitologist, then you're a virologist, which is a form of parasitism.
It is.
Correct? And parasites, remember what we said about parasites in general when we had our original episode?
Successful systems attract parasites.
And what are those successful systems?
Everything in the world.
Correct, including
plants.
Exactly.
So they're parasites of farms.
And our domestic animals. So we've got huge problems with regards to yields for all the cash crops that you and I consume on a daily basis at home by going to our grocery store, picking up some fresh this or fresh that, taking it back, preparing it into some food items, and then consuming them. A lot of those vegetables, fruits, herbs, spices, chickens, fish, meats of various kinds, domestic livestock, etc. Not everybody lives to the harvest point. There are some prices to pay for herding a single thing into a small area, okay? And that's one of the things we're going to discuss in the future is the vulnerability of outdoor farming and outdoor animal husbandry as opposed to controlling everything indoors. And that's where urban agriculture shines.
I guess I wanted to know how you got interested in farming.
Well, it wasn't directly, that's for sure.
Did it have anything to do with parasites?
It has to do with parasites.
It really
I actually worked on a foodborne parasite, Trichinella spiralis, which is if you consume a certain kind of meat that isn't cooked fully, particularly pork in the old days, but it could involve some wild animals now too, you could become infected with a worm that actually chooses to live in your striated skeletal muscles. Occasionally you could die from those things, as has many, many Eskimo villages, for instance, by eating raw polar bear or walrus. So foodborne illnesses is a big deal, and I worked on one of them. So I was involved to begin with in my career in the food system. I wasn't directly involved in it. I mean, I didn't go out and inspect pigs. That was the United States Department of Agriculture's job. But I worked on an organism which affected the price of pork, basically. Whenever they discovered an outbreak of trichinosis in this country, the price of pork dropped out of the bottom of the market. I mean, you could pick it up for free almost. So, yeah, I've been involved off and on all of my professional life, but never as directly involved as I am now with regards to urban agriculture.
Why is that?
Well, I think it was a turning point in my own life when I was teaching and doing research, as you do, as we all do here at Columbia, when I reached a certain point in my research in which the federal funding sources dried up, as they would say. I was unable to get renewed in my grant, and as a result, I began teaching more. And in part of my teaching, I taught a course called Medical Ecology, and during that course, this idea arose about raising food in tall buildings. That's called vertical farming, and we'll get to that much later on in this series of podcasts. But right now, just know that in getting involved in trying to see how much food we could raise inside of a building, I had to pay attention to all the other forms of urban agriculture as well. So that, and in the meantime, I have been brought up to speed, luckily for me, by all of the people that were involved in urban agriculture. They have cornered me and said, the next time you say that, why don't you use these terms? So here, for the kindness of strangers, I would not be doing this, trust me, and they have become my friends, so they're not strangers any longer.
So in a future episode, we'll talk about the vertical farm.
Absolutely.
Its inception and its current state.
We will.
And I'm sure we can talk with people who have made some.
That's correct.
Wouldn't that be nice?
We might even visit a few.
That would be nice.
It would.
All right, now I feel we can get back to the
okay.
third green revelation, because
right.
I must confess, I don't know what the first
or
the
two.
second.
That's
I don't even know what the third is. So I'm going to learn a lot from you, Dr. Despommier. What is the first green revelation?
And hopefully I will too, because you ask insightful questions, and you might ask me a question or two that has never been asked to me before. So
when I do, ring a bell.
I would. We're going to pause the show, and I'm going to look up the answer and come back and give it to
Okay.
you. But mainly, there are lots of open-ended questions with regards to the practicality of urban agriculture. Okay, a lot of people have questions about this. So we're going to not only present the positive side of urban agriculture, but we'll present some of the downsides to this too, some of the issues that it faces over the next, let's say, 100 years.
Okay,
so let's start with a very interesting starting point, and that is the emergence of humans out of Africa. All right, let's go back.
How many years ago is this, Dickson?
As they would now say, let's go back in time to a time when humans were humans.
Homo sapiens.
Homo sapiens. That happened about 200,000 years ago, at
Right.
least according to most anthropologists. But we stuck around in Africa for quite a while.
So Homo sapiens emerged in Africa.
Yes.
And
East
remained.
Africa.
They didn't leave the continent.
They did not, even though they did migrate. Okay, so for climate change reasons, and also for the incursion, I would call this, or immigration of a competitor species, the speculation is the competitor species that we were chased out of East Africa by was the hyena.
Really?
Which actually evolved in Europe. And then migrated down through the land bridges into Africa, chasing, I guess, game animals of various sorts. And hyenas don't do a lot of hunting. They do a lot of scavenging. But they have an incredibly strong jaw. so strong that they can eat the bones of dead animals. So if you're a lion, let's say, for instance, and you capture a gazelle, and you eat all the soft tissues, all the organs are gone, all the skin is gone, the muscle tissue is gone, but the bones are left. Now, when we first started our evolution, bone marrow is a very rich source of energy and good nutrition. So we would wait till all the predators disappeared first, because there was no more meat. Little did they know, of course, that there was meat inside the bones. And by making tools that allowed us to break those bones open, we could access the bone marrow that animals with not as strong jaws as hyenas could not access. So they would leave it for us. And there's a whole school of anthropology that believes that if we hadn't learned how to do that, we would have still been living in the trees. But we came down out of the trees to make use of this resource, and I'm not sure what the events were that allowed us to discover it, but nonetheless, we did.
We did this as Homo sapiens, or
correct, as well, maybe as Homo erectus, maybe even before Homo sapiens. Maybe a couple of million years ago, we learned how to do that.
Okay,
and this allowed our brains to develop very fast, because with meat, apparently it supplies a lot of calories, and the brain tissue actually evolves faster. As a result of that, evolves faster, as I said. So the brain size increased. And then we become tool users. So the first ones out of Africa were actually, I believe they were Homo habilis.
So Dickson, if we had remained vegetarian,
right,
we wouldn't have evolved this quickly. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what it was saying.
Wow.
That's what they say.
Vegans would take issue with you. They might be mad at you.
Well, they got lucky. They took advantage of our carnivorous behavior before they decided to stop eating animal flesh. But the point is that we did that.
And that put us in competition with the hyenas, right?
And other animals that access meat for their living as well. Yeah. But like I said, we could wait till they finished and access the bone marrow.
The hyenas would eat the bone marrow also, right?
They would eat the bones, period.
Yeah, everything.
They ate it all.
And we could not compete with them, so we would get out of their way, basically.
Well, you bet your boots.
Okay.
You bet your boots. So they even eat elephant bones, right? I mean, they still do it.
Sure.
So they are the rulers of the scavenger groups. And they hunt in packs, so it's very difficult to scare them all off at once. They're not just solitary animals, so they hunt as a unit. So here we are. We were chased into the south of Africa. We hunkered down into some caves in South Africa. We also migrated up into Namibia, which is in West Africa. It's a desert-like condition there now, but I think in those days it might not have been. And then as the climate began to change and land bridges open up, because the ice ages were ending, at least at that particular point, the hypothesis was that we were able to avoid all those confrontations with the animals that we didn't want to meet up with, and we could escape out of Africa to get up into Europe. And lo and behold, it turned out that there was already somebody else there.
And at this point, it was mild enough that we could go up there.
That's right.
Because previously it was very cold.
Exactly right. And so there was another human species up there already.
This is the Neanderthals?
Yeah.
And they had migrated earlier from Africa?
From Homo erectus.
Why did they leave earlier? Well, this is not an anthropology show.
We don't know. And I think the evidence is sketchy as to why they did it.
And we wiped them out. Is that the idea?
Well, they seem to have disappeared shortly after we arrived in Europe. And I think there are several hypotheses as to why that might have happened, but what I really wanted to say was that the evidence for Neanderthals farming was zero.
So they hunted and gathered.
They hunted and gathered, but they also stored their grains. They realized that it was important to have reserves,
right,
in case times got bad, and when the animals didn't migrate past their cave, they could still eat. And they made things out of them, which resembled breads and things of this sort. And it was good nutrition. So they were actually well-nutritioned. And in fact, they were very friendly people, apparently. So
you mean well-nourished?
Well-nourished and friendly, because they made friends with Homo sapiens. And interbred.
Yes, correct. You and I have some percent of Neanderthal in our DNA.
We've been accused of having too much, as a matter of fact, by some people. You're acting like a Neanderthal.
Well, we're stereotyping them.
Maybe that's good. I mean, I think the current thinking now is that Neanderthals are quite different people than we originally thought they were. The point is that that we weren't even farming in those days.
We were hunters and gatherers at
we
this
were
point.
still hunting and gathering just like they were. And then there was a third group, the Dawsonians, which we also interbred with.
Can I correct you?
You probably isn't pronounced that way, right?
Denisovians.
I'm sorry.
Denisovan.
Denisovans. Okay. So
don't know.
forget your
Denisovans.
email on this one.
Denisovan.
We're okay. So there's a third.
It's Denisova hominis.
Right. There's a third genotype. And apparently, the current thinking is,
Yes.
the very latest is, and we've tried to find a reference for this, there's two other groups of Homo-like peoples that our genotypes contain as well, which have not yet been identified. Mm-hmm. So we might be a mixture of at least 5 different things, which is quite remarkable, yes. So maybe that allowed us to advance more than the others because they were all inbred and we were apparently outbred. And, you know, there's something called hybrid vigor. You ever hear that term?
Yeah, of course.
So maybe we were a beneficiary of hybrid vigor by actually producing offspring from all of these other hominids. The fact is, though, that for the greater part of 200,000 years, even Homo sapiens, the sole survivor of those lineages from the early hominids, we didn't farm. There's no evidence whatsoever that we farmed.
Okay.
We did a lot of traveling. We were travelers. And so we wandered across the world and occupied places that are now considered exotic locations. When the Bering Strait was a big land bridge, there are lots of potential sites for us to have settled down there. And in fact, there was a delay in the migration route from there into the New World, which we call it the New World, but actually it was all brand new. But still no evidence of farming.
Do we understand what was the trigger to start farming? Was it because before that there was just plenty of places to explore and get food and you didn't have to worry? But then
that's right.
At some point someone thought, it's really a bummer to have to move around all the time and the weather is lousy. When it rains, we don't get this.
Yeah.
Maybe
if you look around the world at the sites where we can prove that farming did exist.
Do we know where it started?
It started in a number of places. That's the interesting part of this whole story, is that the first green revolution, which is that's what the first one was.
So the discovery of farming or the development of farming by Homo sapiens, that's the first green revolution?
That's number one.
Okay. Where did it begin?
Well, it depends on, if you're Chinese, you can ask that question, and I'll show you where that began.
So somewhere in China?
Somewhere in China. Okay. And the grains were not what you thought they were. They were not rice to begin with, but barley-like grains, which grew wild, which, if you cultivated them, they grew better, but they were less hardy, so you had to take better care of them. So there's an older take on this, by the way, not so old, back in the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s, that suggests that actually plants captured us by changing into a domestic form, which required us to take care of them, which is a very interesting way of looking at things.
That's a twist.
It is a twist. So maybe domestic animals were the same. The point is that in China, we can pinpoint to a place where we began to domesticate plants for our own purposes. In the Middle East, there was another center for agriculture in which wheat was the main product. Then if we move to the Central American peninsulas of, let's say, the Yucatan or the Balsas Valley, which is actually a part of Mexico down in Chiapas, you can find remnants of starch granules from corn-like plants, which are different from all the other grasses that the current corn plant was derived from. And that's how they could tell that it was a domesticated plant rather than a wild plant, because the actual microstructure of the starch granules are different. So you can dig through these archaeological sites and find what they were eating based on some very, very sophisticated evidence. And so,
how about North America? Anything there?
Actually, the answer is no, because corn was the main crop discovered by whoever was living in the Balsas Valley, and it spread like wildfire from that point on because it was easy to grow, produced a lot of energy. You could store the grain, in this case the kernels. You could grind them into breads and stuff like this, or you could rehydrate them and eat them as they were. They grew like wildfire, but they required a constant attention and a lot of water. Okay, that was the whole trick. It was a lot of water, and you had to keep all the other plants that wanted the same amount of water. You had to keep them out of there somewhere. So you had to learn how to weed. All right? This one plant, corn, revolutionized the entire South, Central, and North American community.
Do we think they planted the corn in rows?
Or
they just kind of scattered around?
Well, we don't have any evidence of what the early farms looked like.
Yeah.
But the point is that nothing
They didn't
existed.
have iPhones. We couldn't take pictures.
They had no iPhones. They had no Grange societies. They had no burpee seed companies to write to. They didn't have a clue as to how to do this, in fact. And in fact, some areas in the Middle East were actually trashed as the result of not knowing what to do next. That is, you have to add fertilizer to the soils if you're going to use them up like this, because it's going to draw nutrients out of the soil, right?
Did they learn this by making errors?
Oh, did they?
So they
Big
would.
time.
How many?
Big time.
So if you plant corn in a field,
yeah.
can you do it again the next year?
You can, but you can only do it for 3 years without having to do anything else.
All right. So these guys would plant it for 3 or 4 years, then all of a sudden, boom, nothing grows.
Exactly. There are still some cultures that do that. For instance, if you go down,
they rotate fields, right?
If you go into the South American jungle, the Yanomami farm, and their crops, because the soils are so poor, they only get 3 years of crops from it, even though they use fertilizer. And in this case, they just burn the plants and use the ashes as the fertilizer.
So then the ancient humans would have noticed that after the 3rd or 4th year, nothing grew. So they probably moved
on.
And then a few years later, someone who forgot
Right.
planted at the original place, and
Maybe.
it grew. And
Maybe
eventually
the
they
early-
figured it out, right?
Early starts and stops, but
How would they make fertilizer, though? What would they use? Animal feces or
they
human?
could use dead animals,
human feces,
fish.
and then get infectious diseases.
Yeah, well, they could use human feces. That's exactly right. So half of the world still does that, by the way. This is not this might be an ancient technology for empowering plants to grow where they shouldn't be growing, because ecologically speaking, nature abhors a monoculture. All right? The biggest deal about nature is that it's diverse.
Right.
And it maintains that diversity through ecological relationships.
And it's naturally occurring hybrid vigor.
Correct. Whereas humans decided to go in another direction.
This was we didn't know any better, right?
Well, we knew better for us. What we wanted is a constant food supply that's reliable and not only dependable, but could serve as a trade item as well. All right?
Sure.
So the grains dominated that scene as a result. So you have rice, you have barley, you have millet, you have corn, you have wheat. Those are the big grain crops.
And there we can find evidence that these were grown, as you said before, in the remains.
Exactly. In fact, we have some of the original wheat grains, and you can do the genetics on them and find out how different they are today versus the way they were then. And you can tell every one of these grains that are domesticated arose from hybrids between wild plants to give them the characteristics necessary to produce larger grains, but with lots of care. Those would have died out without humans taking care of them. And the only ones we'd have left is the wild ones that could resist diseases, for instance, droughts, floods, that sort of thing. Our domestic plants haven't got any of those abilities whatsoever.
Right. So the ability to grow larger and larger quantities of grains allowed the populations to remain in one place longer and to grow larger, right?
Right. So
and with more population, there are more smart people who figure out, well, let's get the animals to plow the fields.
Yeah, of course.
And they start. So did planting farms come before domestication of animals for food?
Well, that's a tough call. I think Jared Diamond has. He's a famous author that writes about this a lot, and one of his books, Collapse, talks about this issue in several of his chapters.
Should I read it?
I would. Yeah, it's a good read.
What is essential reading? If I am a new listener to urban agriculture, and I want to be able to think intelligently about these early episodes where you were telling us this history. What should I read? Collapse?
Well, I would go online.
Yes.
Right? And the first thing I would do is just scan Wikipedia for various subjects that relate to this. And I know Wikipedia is not the best resource for anything, but it's a quick read and it gets you involved. And the best Wikipedia pages have lots of references after that.
So what should people wiki for? What keyword? First Green Revolution?
Yeah, or the establishment of farming, or the earliest farmers. And associated with those early farms, in most of those places, you will have the early cities.
Okay.
And you were absolutely right. I mean, not having to run after game animals and wait for their seasonal ups and downs in Africa, say, for instance, or in other places too, being able to stay put has huge advantages with regards to the establishment of culture. So before that, even though we were artistically inclined and we made jewelry and clothing of various kinds with wonderful decorations, we painted caves up and all this other stuff, we didn't really have written language. We didn't have much in the way of written music. We didn't have anything in the way of cities, nor did we have science. Although we had the application of observation to farming. Now, here's a very interesting little tidbit, which I just happened to have run across in my my own discovery of this field. Okay, can you tell me what the first recognizable built structure was in human history and where it might be?
You mean we can see it today?
It's still there.
The pyramids?
No.
Before the pyramids?
Before the pyramids.
Of course, pyramids are only 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, is that right?
Yeah, they're
not that old. Before the pyramids.
This is way before
the Brochs in Scotland.
You're heading in the right direction.
You know those Brochs, those Neolithic structures? Those are cool.
Yes.
I went to see
Stonehenge is one of them.
Yeah. It's before that, huh?
There's one even before that, and it's in Ireland.
Okay.
And it's called Newgrange.
Newgrange.
And if you typed it out, you'd get it. So that's very interesting because you mentioned these Brochs or these henges, all right? So Stonehenge, which is in England, not in Scotland, what were they there for? What were they doing? And some people say, well, they were primitive astronomical observation points. They could predict things in astronomy based on the structure of these buildings.
3200 BC.
That's pretty
So
long
that's
ago.
the Neolithic period, before Stonehenge and before the pyramids.
Yeah, that's way back.
But you have to admit, I was on the right.
You were? No,
right?
Vince.
I'm not just an infection person.
Not just another pretty face.
I am just an infection person. But I've learned how to ask. As a scientist, I've learned how to ask
questions.
Sure.
So Newgrange is a great place. And what does it do? It has
Been
a
there?
purpose. No, I'd
it looks spectacular.
What does it do, do you think?
What does it do?
Yeah.
For the people who built it, you mean?
Yeah. Why did they build it?
Well, it's basically a large circular mound with passageways and chambers inside.
Passageways and chambers.
I bet they stored grain in it.
Well, it's called Newgrange, but I don't think that's what they actually did with it.
I have no idea.
Well, remember I said that the anthropologists think that these early structures were astronomical in purpose, to predict things. And the summer solstice and the rising of certain recognizable astronomical items like Sirius, for instance, the star, one of the brightest stars in the heaven, or the position of the Milky Way at a certain time of year, or the rising of the sun at a certain time of year. I know Vince and I sit with a spectacular view of Western view. We can see the weather patterns, for instance, coming in from the west. By the way, it's very cold out today. And
it got cold all of a sudden.
It did. And if you're a farmer, is this a good time of the year to start farming? And I think the answer is no, although they're thinking about it. So, and we're going to come back to that concept too. You can look at various times of the year and watch the sunset, because we don't come in before the sun goes up, but we do usually go home as the sun is setting. And the sun will set at a different position every day. It will march across our horizon. The same is true for the rise of the sun. It'll march across your horizon. Now, there is a time when everybody's horizon says, when the sun is at this particular position, we should plant our seeds.
So you think Newgrange may in part have served that kind of purpose?
Well, it seems to line up with the beginning of the summer. And Stonehenge.
That's cool.
Stonehenge does the same thing.
They have to build this big structure just for that? Couldn't they put a stick in the ground?
You're going to take. They did. These are very large. They're not necessarily sticks.
They're made of stones.
They're immutable references to the movement of celestial objects, which predict the best time to plant and perhaps even the best time to harvest.
Does Stonehenge have a similar function?
Yeah.
And are there other structures from the similar era around the world?
There are many structures throughout the world that fall into this category. The sundial is one of those big items.
Do we have any here in the U.S.?
Well, we might, but we haven't discovered them yet. Let's put it this way. Or at least I'm not aware of them. I mean, maybe people listening to this podcast would like to contribute their knowledge to this part of the subject, because these early calendars were kept for a good reason. Not just to measure when the animals will migrate past their doorstep, but it correlated with growing seasons. And so harvests and all kinds of religious rituals were associated with ensuring that the crops that they planted would be harvestable when the time came.
You know, from our contemporary perspective, it seems, why would you have to do this? But think if we had no writing materials, no calendars, no phones, how do you keep track of time? You know, after a week, everything is lost. How many days has it been since I planted? I have no idea.
Now you've got the idea. So the invention of writing came about as a necessity to keep track of things.
Yeah.
And how much did I plant? Where did I plant it? How much did I get back for it? How much is it worth? All of these things were recorded and words were created to account for these behaviors. And then the next thing, I mean, I'm sounding like Joseph Campbell right now, but I hope I don't sound like Joseph Campbell right now, because I enjoyed his series very, very much. All right. And he was a wonderful raconteur. And he related some
kind of these, like you.
Well, no, he's a league ahead, way out in front.
Really?
Yeah, because he made his living doing this. And he had a wonderful series on television, which I had the privilege of watching from start to finish, maybe several times even, in which all of these ancient religious rituals and behaviors could be tied into some life-threatening thing. If you didn't do that, then these bad things happen, and it always related back to either food or water, right? Because those are the essentials.
Right.
All right. So
so this is now the first
Green Revolution
was when humans learned how to plant.
Yes, and
okay, that must have gone on for a long time. This first revolution.
Did, but you know, within 1,000 years, probably 1,000 years, in many places throughout the world, it's as though aliens came and discovered, they're doing this in Mexico. We should tell these people over here, well, you haven't got corn, but try it with wheat. It'll work. I mean, it seems...
So are you saying word spread?
Well, no, word didn't spread, we don't think. We just think that humans evolved to a point where they no longer wished to continue to migrate.
Yeah.
And if you're not going to migrate, you better find something to eat, because if you don't do that, you're going to die.
Well, as I said before, though, I don't know what came first, the desire not to migrate or the fact that you had to establish some food sources just to be able to grow. You wanted to have a family, right? Or, but I don't even know if they had desires. Do you think they were just like us?
I hope so, because I think we are direct descendants.
Because we are predicting or trying to reconstruct their behavior based on how we feel today. That's how we do most things, right?
Sure. But just keep this in mind. I'm a parasitologist by training. You're a virologist by training. A lot of what we just said is highly speculative or based on common knowledge that we've picked up from reading other resources. Okay. So I think Joseph Campbell's book is a wonderful book, and I'm probably blocking.
What's the name of it?
Yeah, that's right. We
want to look it up?
Thank God for the internet. Yeah. The Ascent of Man? No, that was another series.
American mythologist. That's him, right?
Probably right.
He was a mythologist.
Oh, yeah, sure.
He wrote,
he wrote a lot of books.
Works by Campbell. The Hero with 1,000 Faces, The Masks of God, Historical Atlas of World Mythology, The Power of Myth.
The Power of Myth.
Is that it?
Yeah, perhaps that's the one.
Yes. So his widest popular recognition followed his collaboration with Bill Moyers.
That's right.
On the PBS series The Power of Myth. Is that the one you're talking about?
And that's worth watching, because I think in it you will discover all of these earliest efforts at farming, the connections to rituals to ensure that their crops endured. And from that beginning, most of the modern religions arose.
What was he trained as?
I think he was a bona fide anthropologist.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think so. But there were many others that contributed to this knowledge base as well. So the point is that about 11,000 years ago in the Balsas Valley, we have direct evidence that the starch grains were those of domesticated corn, and therefore they had domesticated corn, which means that it had to be earlier than that, because this is the earliest that we can find. So if you want to speculate back a little bit further and say, well, maybe it was another 2,000 or 3,000 years. So a safe way to say this is that 15,000 years ago, there were no farms. Okay?
15,000 years ago, there were no farms.
That's right. Now, that's a powerful statement because from
it's not that long.
That's right. That's exactly what I was going to say. From 15,000 years ago to today, look at what happened. We were about 1 million people throughout the world.
15,000 years ago?
Yeah.
Wow.
And we started to farm. Farming gave rise to civilizations. Civilizations gave rise to huge cities, lots of people, culture. And today, we have 7 billion people, and we now farm the size of South America in landmass. And we know this.
Wait, the total farming area equals South America.
It does, and that's just planted crops, okay? This is just planted crops. Now, how do we know that?
It seems like it should be more.
Well, it is more because we have grazing animals to account for, too.
So this is just planted crops.
This is just planted crops. So how do we know that?
I was just going to ask you,
I'm
Dickson,
so glad
how do we know that?
Because people will say, how does that guy know? Come on, he's a parasitologist. He doesn't know anything about this. Well, he doesn't have to, because we have an agency which oversees the surveillance of Earth.
What's that called?
It's called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA for short.
They oversee the surveillance?
They do. And would you like to know how they do it?
Wait, I thought they put rockets into space. That's just one of the things they do?
The rocket is carrying something.
How do they survey the Earth?
I will tell you.
And when did NASA come into being?
NASA is a 1960s organization, as I recall, early 1960s. It could even be earlier than that, but I doubt it because I think we didn't have a space program before that. And I think Kennedy was the president that initiated the NASA program.
Okay.
We are going to go to the moon. Why? Not because it's easy, but because it's difficult. Remember him saying that.
1958, Dwight Eisenhower established NASA.
Okay, Dwight. Way to go, Dwight.
He had, Eisenhower was a good president. He established it with a civilian rather than military orientation.
Because his saying was, beware of the
That's
military
right.
industrial complex, which he was, of course, part of.
NASA is focused on better understanding Earth.
That's right.
Through the Earth Observing System.
That's right.
Wow.
So Landsat, it stands for Land Surveying Satellite. There are now 8 different versions of that satellite. And the satellites go around the Earth very, very fast. Right?
How fast do they go, Dickson?
I believe it takes only 4 hours for them to make a complete revolution around the Earth.
Yeah, it's like 17,000 miles per hour.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
And so in doing so, they've got instruments on these observing satellites.
And they observe the Earth.
They observe the Earth, which can detect plant life.
Really?
Based on reflectometry. And the reflectivity of each plant is different because the leaf shapes are different.
From space?
From space.
Oh.
They can tell you what kind of tree that is. They can tell you they can not only tell you what kind of corn it is, they can tell you how old it is. And they can tell you whether or not it's going to succeed or not by looking at the weather patterns.
And they can tell you how many acres of corn are planted on the globe.
They can tell you how much we farm.
And
so
that's
when
why
you add it all up,
South America thing.
That's right.
Wow. And there's a website you can go to and get this information?
Well, it's the NASA website, and Landsat is the Earth Observatory is the one that you can go to.
I'm so glad we started this pod. It seems to me like I am going to learn an awful lot, Dickson.
Well, it's not just about agriculture, as we're going to learn. Okay, what we're talking about is not how to grow food inside the city limits. What we're talking about is why we should grow food within the city limits. Why should we be concerned about this?
Look at this Landsat. There's a whole website of Landsats.
But of course, it's amazing. It's up to 8.
I really didn't know very much about this at all. Yeah, it's number 8. Year 1, number 8 just went up a year, and they have these incredible pictures.
They do.
Where you can see green and brown.
That's right.
And blue. Do you know what the blue is, Dickson?
It has to be water, I presume.
And white.
That's right. It's snow.
But there's not much snow left.
Well, it's
shrinking.
Decreasing.
And that is why we know things are melting.
We are in an interglacial period. That's correct.
Wow.
So the group that manages the data sets from Landsat 8 is at Boston University. Mm-hmm. So I had the privilege of actually emailing the director of that program.
Could we do a podcast with them?
I would love to. Because
someone from Landsat.
They don't have to believe in global climate change. They can measure it. Mm-hmm. You don't have to believe in it, right? You can go out and see whether it's happening or not. You can ask a question. And if you ask the right questions, you're going to get the right answers. These are not the answers that a lot of people don't want to hear, though. The American public is not ready. I heard this said by one of the senators who doesn't believe that climate change issues are being accelerated by human activity. So if you tell them that, they're going to say, well, the American people are not ready to hear this, so therefore we're not going to talk about it. That's about the worst thing you could ever say about an issue that's going to affect everybody's life.
This idea that one or a few people can decide for everyone is absurd.
Called a representative democracy, right? So that's what we're stuck with, and I think it works pretty well for the most part.
But in science, as you know,
you can't vote whether or not pi equals 3.141 something. You can't vote that. All right? The Greeks
you know what they say? You're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts.
That's right. Do you remember the Greeks had an argument once in their forum about how many teeth are in a horse's head? And they fought like tooth and nail over this thing. Tooth and nail, no pun intended. But somebody said, well, why don't we just go out and count them? And they said, don't be ridiculous. It's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And so, of course, they went out and counted them and found out what the truth was. I don't want the truth. I want a good argument.
I bet they found some variation. They found some variation.
They must have, but...
How many teeth are in a human?
I believe there are 32.
Always, or some people have more or less?
Well, there are some anomalies, yeah.
Yeah.
I think Muhammad Ali had a few less than most people, but he also eliminated a few in other people as well. So getting back to the issue at hand, that is, how do we know?
Do you want to keep these to an hour, Dickson?
No, let's make them go as long as we...
Okay, fine.
I don't care.
No problem.
No, I think more than an hour is fine. So Landsat photographs of the Earth based on plant reflectivities, and I can train the satellite as to how to recognize a plant by measuring the reflectivity on Earth and then translating that data up into the satellite and say, whenever you see this signature, it's corn, soybeans, green beans, tomatoes, pineapples. You can do it for anything.
Right.
So they did. They have trained these satellites how to recognize plants on Earth. And it is amazing.
So if someone's growing acres of pot, they can pick it up.
Yes.
Like what's the minimum of a crop that they can pick up?
Pot grow, I don't know. You'd have to ask the team up in Boston University.
Like an acre or something?
Yeah, but pot growers usually grow their pot underneath other plants, so they can't be detected this way. So there are some tricks to the trade, and that's probably one of them that succeeded for quite a while, actually.
Now that it's legal in some states, they have farms that grow it, I presume.
They do. Yeah, they do.
So they're not hidden and...
I don't follow that literature, so I don't know. So getting back to the farmland, though, the amount of farmland that arose as the result of the first Green Revolution allowed the human species to increase from 1 million individuals to 7.5 billion individuals in less than 10,000 years.
But wasn't there a second revolution somewhere in there? And I'll bet I know what it is.
Okay.
I could be wrong.
Lay it on me.
I would bet the use of machinery to improve farming. Is that the second? That's the second?
There was a lot of things that contributed to the second one.
Like power and machinery and coal and oil and
dynamite.
All that.
Don't forget
dynamite
that.
So you could clear fields, yes.
Right. What about fertilizers?
So this is basically the mechanical industrial revolution.
The industrialization of the first green revolution was the second green revolution. Even genetic modification of plants to survive more droughts or to survive more floods or to be resistant to plant diseases or insect pests. All of those modifications of plants, that's all included into the second green revolution.
When did that begin?
Well, it began as soon as the Industrial Revolution started.
When was it, what?
1700s.
1700s.
And they claim that Manchester, England, was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and I believe them because I've actually been to Manchester, and I know you have also, and you can see the remnants of it still there. So the tractor was the one thing that really mechanized farming, and of course the use of dynamite to
When was that
fields.
developed?
The first tractor that was produced by Henry Ford was 1907. It was
Well, that's a long time after the 1700s.
That's right, and it was meant to run on ethanol.
But before that, people were using animals, right?
Of course. And they were clearing fields using animals also.
Right. And when was dynamite invented?
Dynamite was invented by Alfred Nobel.
Right.
Back in the late 1800s.
To help clear fields.
No, that isn't why he invented it.
That's why he didn't. But that was used by farmers to clear the trees out. Much easier than cutting them down.
It was. And you know what? It depressed Alfred Nobel to realize what a devastating effect his invention had on the landscape.
Really?
And, yeah, he was very put off by that. And, of course, he invested most of his fortune through his inheritance to establish what we now call the Nobel Prizes.
Right. He tried to get a little cred back, right?
Well,
restore something. But now they're associated with their own controversy, which is whether they're good for science or not,
this
right?
Is all true.
Or any other
this
field.
Is all true.
But that's another podcast. This week in Nobels. Second revolution, is it still ongoing? Or
Sure it is.
Because you mentioned genetic modification.
It is. I did.
This is something, now I'm going to guess that this started in the 70s with recombinant DNA, but probably you could mate and produce monocultures long before that from Gregor Mendel and even before.
No, the original plants that we now call grain plants originated as an accident of nature which was recognized by humans and then selected.
Explain. I don't understand what you just said. An accident of nature? Why is that?
Because they were naturally occurring hybrids.
So these grain plants didn't exist in nature, and then all of a sudden, boom, there was an accident of recombination or mating.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
And a person was walking and saw them and said, oh.
Right. And not only did they see them, they saw them growing in certain places. All right. Like, say, for instance, the wheat that we now know.
Can we have an episode on wheat?
Sure.
And on corn?
Sure.
So there's no wild corn, right?
Well, there was no such thing as wild corn. Wild corn is a grass, by the way. Okay? It's a grass.
So it doesn't grow with those cobs
on it,
No,
of course
right?
not. The original corn plants or the original grass plants that gave rise to corn plants, if you go back in history, you can actually find pictures of these things because those plants still exist. And they don't produce anything that looks like a corn plant, all right? But seeing the hybrid, it's a triple hybrid that actually gave rise to the corn plant. Seeing it, the grains are large, they're edible, and my goodness, this plant has potential.
So someone ate it at some point and decided it was good.
Maybe they were eating it for a while and said, I wish we could have more of this.
Someone figured out how to make a whole cob.
Or they figured out how to plant.
When was this, roughly?
Well, they know the exact date of these starch granules, okay? It was discovered in 11,700 and some odd years ago from today in the Balsas Valley of Mexico, as I mentioned before.
Wow.
So the wheat plants were developed a little bit later than that.
Now, wheat occurs in the Middle East
as well? In the Middle East. It occurs as a wild plant, which doesn't look anything like the domesticated plant. It's a smaller version of it. And again, I'm a little bit, I would say I'm out of my field, no pun intended here, but I'm only relating what I've read about this. So I'd rather not trust to memory.
Should we call the episode that? I'm out of my field.
No, I'm outstanding in my field or standing out in my field or something like that. I think the story on wheat is that it arose in the Middle East.
Right.
In an area which is not too far from Amman, Jordan, in what was then even a desert. So how can a domestic plant that we've come to rely on heavily for our energy resources arise in a situation, first, why were people living in the desert? And they were living near but not at the oases. And then how did these plants become domesticated?
Yeah. Dickson, is it fair to say that most of our, or all of our major crops, let's just stick with the grain crops.
Sure.
Wheat, corn, barley,
rice.
What else? There must be others, other grains. They don't actually exist in nature in the form that they're farmed.
No, they all exist in some form,
but they're
nature.
Different.
But they're not. Let's see, what is the right word here? They don't yield high enough amounts of them.
So we've modified them.
We have all of them. We've domesticated.
What about the
all.
non-grain plants?
I call these plants on a leash.
Like lettuce and broccoli, and
those are all contrived.
They're all
from nature.
contrived.
Every bit of it. Like, for instance, the apple, which is I know no one knows this, of course, but it's the difference between natural selection and artificial selection. It gets you back to genetics right away.
It's pretty neat what we did, though.
It's very cool.
Right?
It's extremely cool.
So if on some other planet you think they made apples?
Well, an apple equivalent. So apples started out as a little inedible fruit in the middle of a valley in Kazakhstan.
Wow. I know I think you've mentioned this on TWIP.
And everyone knows where it came from because you can trace it right back. The plant that gave rise to these apples is still there. And it was then nurtured and hybridized, and when you found an apple that was slightly larger and slightly sweeter, you saved the seeds and you planted those, and you just kept doing this. And I want it to be bigger and sweeter until finally, you know how many varieties of apples we have today? Varieties.
Hundreds.
Remember, they're all the same species. We have 20,000 different
They're all
apples.
the same species?
They are.
What's the species name? Want me to look it up?
Let's go to the...
I type in apple. I type in apple and I
it's
go to...
Despommier because that's what my last name means, apple trees, right?
The top hit on Apple is Apple Computer. And
New York.
I want to know the fruit. And the first page is all technology stuff. It shows you how much Apple dominates.
That's right. So apple, the fruit. I used to know the name of it, but I didn't
One species.
Didn't commit
That
it.
is amazing.
Yeah, it is. You know why? Because you can hybridize all over the place with it and get another apple.
Malus domestica.
Thank you.
Oh, it's in the rose family.
Malus domestica.
Rosaceae.
We're both going to learn a lot on this program.
We could have a show on apples.
We could.
A show on pears.
We could do that.
We could get an expert.
Peaches.
There's so much we can do with
There
this.
is, but those are not really urban
you know what?
agricultural products. Okay?
Well, at some point you should tell us what are.
I will. When we get to that.
And probably nothing we've talked about so far.
We're still working on the first green revolution.
The tree is something hard to grow in the urban setting, I presume.
It is not. Well, there are some trees that are easy, and they grow better because of the air pollution from the automobiles.
Okay.
That's like fertilizer for a plant, right? So we're back to the first.
We're on 2 now.
No. We have to go back to 1 a little bit, though,
okay,
because we have to say what it did.
Well, you said it made the population go from 1 million to 7.5 billion.
It allowed for the establishment of cities.
And people got some leisure time. They could
urban
think, they could write, they
agriculture
could paint.
In the beginning.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Or you could become a scribe.
Yeah, you could
or
make
you could
music.
be a poet.
Yeah.
Or you could be a musician.
Basically, you could be creative.
You could write books.
Instead of worrying where your next meal will come from.
Language.
Right.
So what I'm saying now is that without farming, we would still be wandering the planet looking for our next meal.
That's why you're interested in farming, because everything comes from farming. Why didn't you tell me this before?
Why didn't you ask? Well, it does. I mean, everything it's very fundamental, right?
You know what, though? If you go back even further, everything comes from viruses. So our guest on TWIV 2 weeks ago said he thought that all life has evolved from virus-like elements.
Well, virus-like, that's true, but a virus is not a life form.
No, but small replicating, self-replicating nucleic acids in the primordial swamp.
I got it.
Everything, even apples came from viruses. All things come from farming because it gives humans time to be humans, to be creative.
We created human civilization.
That should be in the name of this title, this first episode.
Only after farming could we establish cities. Only after farming could we become civilized. And so these early cities...
But you know what, Dickson? Is it true to say that only after farming we could have wars?
Oh, well, I'm going to get to that in a minute.
Okay.
The answer is yes, because, well, war in the strictest sense, yes, because you didn't
now
have
you have something that someone else wants.
That's right. That's right. They were willing to let you do all the work, and then they would come in, right?
Yeah.
So the very first city listed that I could find evidence for is Jericho.
Mm-hmm.
All right? It's like 8,000 years old, maybe a little bit less than that. We're not quite sure, because there are many levels to Jericho, right? So remember that old biblical song, Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho, right? That was a war. What was it? What were they fighting? A lot of them were, quotes unquote, religious in nature.
Sure.
But the real root of all of it, it was fighting for resources.
Resources.
And
right.
in those days, even though they had some forms of barter, what were they bartering with? Animals, humans, of course, for slaves, clothing, artifacts, jewelry, food. Food was a big deal. So, all of the liquids like wine, for instance, we've still found wrecks of Greek ships and Phoenicians with urns filled with wine. It was a big trade item. Where does wine come from? It comes from a crop, grapes. So if you look back through history, it just keeps coming back to the resources that were available. And so Jericho, it's probably still a city today, but it's not much of a city compared to what it used to be. Then there was Ur. Then there was Nineveh. These are all Middle Eastern cities that were established for what reason only? And the only reason that we can see that makes any sense is that A, they were located near springs. That's the water. B, the land next to those springs was used to farm, to produce the food for the cities. And they started to accumulate lots of people as the result. And when you put a lot of people together in a little place, you're right. You get the advent of architecture, the advent of science, because you have leisure time. You're absolutely right. You have leisure time. So the farming...
And you get crime.
Did a huge... Of course you get crime. And of course you
parasites.
When you put a monoculture in one place, that's what you're going to get.
Do you know what? You should hear this. Our guest 2 weeks ago on TWIV 275,
yep.
Eugene Koonin,
yep.
he said, and I'm going to find this quote for you because you will love it.
This is part of a cross-pollination of this urban agricultural series.
Do you think I should not do that?
No. Do it. Absolutely.
I mean, I don't mean to promote anything.
It's not a matter of promoting. You're going to make a point here.
Make a point, and he quoted in one of his papers. Let's see if I can find it here. Please be patient with me. Wait.
Vincent does a lot of editing also, so this may have
not a lot.
Pause.
Not a lot. Here's exact quote: "Cheaters inevitably evolve when there is a chance to cheat."
Right.
Inevitably.
Right.
And that's what happened in these cities.
Right.
The guy sees his neighbor with some nice cloth.
That's right.
Or
so
some
hence
nice
the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
Hence the arising of religious tenets and
Dickson,
laws and civil liberties and all these other things that you come to take for granted. And if you break one, you get thrown into jail because you're endangering the resources for everybody else.
This is very sad because people do cool things and then they get to be cheaters.
Do you remember the Iceman that was discovered up in the Alps because the glaciers melted? He was killed.
Yeah, right. Listen, Dickson, so the major point here is that we are now at 7.5 billion people. For us to get much further, we still have to have a sustainable supply of food.
So the first Green Revolution gave rise to the second Green Revolution out of a dire need
to
supply food in greater amounts to a growing population.
Is that right?
That's right.
We needed to make more food because populations were booming.
They were. They were booming to an extent based on the advent of the Industrial Revolution and empowering people to accomplish more in a shorter period of time.
So we had to do things like invent tractors and figure out ways
harvesting
to clear.
Machines, planting machines. And there was one other biggie. That was the end of slavery, at least in the United States. Slavery came to an end back in the 1860s. And as a result, there goes the quotes-unquote farm machinery. Those were the people that were used as farm machines.
Well, of course, the reason for getting rid of it was completely
had nothing
appropriate.
To do.
It was because people should not be used as slaves.
This is exactly correct.
And Abe Lincoln and his co-workers had the right idea. But out of that came the development.
The need for a substitute farming technology.
Yes.
And so that's when oil was discovered, the diesel engine was invented, dynamite.
These were discovered for
and the tractor,
other reasons, but they were all applied to farming immediately.
That's right. They had the perfect storm for these to all come together at once, to empower a nation that had no longer relying one nation. Thank goodness we were united, and they could not rely on the backs of disadvantaged people to make themselves more wealthy.
That was the second.
That was the advent of the second.
And we are still in the second green, aren't we?
It might have ended
when?
It might have ended when things began to sour. All right? So the souring of the second green revolution is the topic for our next.
No pun intended, right?
No. It's the topic for our next podcast.
Wait, the souring is when?
We'll get to that. We will cover the history
of what happened. Something.
What happened to farming next.
Okay. Oh, you're going to make a story arc.
Darn right.
You're going to have people come back because you're not going to finish it.
Come on, and then we're going to talk about what's happening in the future, too.
All right.
So we've got 3 podcasts. One is, where did farming start?
So we did the first and second green revolutions.
We intimated that the second green revolution occurred as a necessity for supplying food for a burgeoning population that was generated through the invention of industrial revolution.
Okay.
So that was the industrial revolution, and the green revolution went hand in hand.
And what's for the next podcast? You're going to talk about the third?
I'm going to talk about the demise of the second green revolution. The demise of the second.
That will take us the whole next episode?
And then what can we expect in the future if we continue to do what we're doing, or if we decide to change and do something different?
That sounds like a plan. When should we record that? Right now?
2 weeks from now.
2 weeks from now.
I could do it right now because we're on a roll.
You're ready? You're ready?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, all right. That's a good way to end this up. You know what? I think we should encourage people to send in comments and questions.
Oh, we would love that to happen.
And you also said that they could send in suggestions for topics.
But of course.
Do you want to know about the history of the grape? Sure.
That's right. No, we could do that.
Whatever
we can at least
like.
give references to that.
So I should tell people where they can send their questions and comments. We have a website for this podcast.
This is exciting.
It's called urbanag.ws. URBANAG, urbanag.ws. Very simple.
Sounds
and you can send us email to urbanag@urbanag.ws.
Right.
Would that be good?
That would be great.
And we will read them on the show.
We will. The ones that can be read on the show.
Now, we don't know when we will be releasing this, but it will be interesting to see how long it takes for that first.
That's right.
The first email, we'll give them an Urban Ag mug. How's that?
Right.
We are still in the process of developing artwork for this podcast. We haven't yet submitted it to iTunes, but you will be able to find it someday soon on iTunes, right?
Yeah, I think within a week would be a good time.
Also, within a week of maybe everyone hearing this, yes.
Right.
You can also find it at urbanag.ws.
Right.
And the name of this podcast, of course, is Urban Agriculture.
Got it.
Urbanag at urbanag.ws.
Trying to keep it simple.
Yes.
Trying to keep it simple.
Anything else that we need to say before we say goodbye, Dickson?
No, I think we're going to establish a pick of the week for myself or yourself.
Pick of the week, yes.
And then someone that's listening gets their pick of the week, too.
So in this one, a pick of the week could be anything agriculture related.
Well, I would like my pick of the week to be the map that was published in Science that depicted all of the earliest sites for agriculture around the world. It was in a review article not too long ago.
Really?
Yeah, on the evolution of farming.
You're going to send me the link for that?
I will gladly do that.
Or going to have me
happily. No, we'll both look for it and we'll find it. Don't worry.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, that should be a good map.
We will have our listeners are welcome to send in listener picks as well.
You bet.
All right. Thank you, Dickson.
You're welcome, Vincent.
So as I said, you'll find this podcast at urbanag.ws and also on iTunes. And if you have comments or questions, send them to urbanag at urbanag.ws. Dickson Despommier has his own network of websites.
His tangled network.
Tangled web. Verticalfarm.com, trichinella.org, and medicalecology.org.
Right.
Wonderful idea, Dickson.
Good. I'm glad you like it, too.
And this first one was great. And as you can see, I'm very curious, and I'll ask you lots of questions.
This is great, too.
Thanks for doing this.
You're a wonderful co-host.
I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you can find all my work at virology.ws. You know, Dickson,
yes,
we haven't figured out a way to end this podcast. You know, on TWIV, we say another TWIV is viral or another TWIP is parasitic.
That's right.
What do we say in this one? We'll see you out in the field? There's no fields in the urban farm, is there?
Hopefully not.
We'll see you in the vertical farm?
Yeah, see you upstairs in the farm.
You want to do that? That's cool.
Sure.
Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Urban Agriculture. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back very soon. We'll see you up in the farm.
That's it.
Is that it?
See you upstairs at the farm.
See you upstairs at the farm.
That's it.
Okay.